In the unforgiving landscape of Montana's Bitterroot Valley, where nature's fury can transform serene waterways into deadly torrents within minutes, one woman's extraordinary journey defies all expectations. This is the remarkable story of Olivia Parker, a 34-year-old elementary school teacher who survived a catastrophic flash flood by leading 5 orphaned students to safety through treacherous terrain, only to be rescued by a mysterious hunter who would change their lives forever. Through courage, intuition, and an unwavering dedication to her students, Olivia not only survived the raging waters that claimed 7 lives that terrible day, but found herself transformed by an encounter that would unravel secrets buried for nearly a decade and redefine the meaning of family for 6 lost souls. Her salvation came through the wilderness expertise of Mason Reed, a reclusive hunting guide, whose tracking abilities led him to the most unexpected discovery of his life. 5 children connected to him by bonds of blood he never knew existed, and a determined teacher whose protective instinct rivaled that of the most formidable forces in nature. Join us as we uncover the astonishing tale of disaster, survival, and the hidden connections that emerge when civilization's safeguards collapse, and human resilience is tested against the raw power of the natural world. This is a story that challenges our understanding of both courage and the invisible threads that bind strangers together in the face of overwhelming odds. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The spring of 2023 had been unusually wet across the American Northwest, with rainfall records shattered and water tables rising to levels unseen in decades. By late April, meteorologists had begun issuing cautionary statements about potential flooding throughout the region. For the residents of Pinecrest, Montana, these warnings had become background noise, a common spring occurrence in a town built alongside the usually picturesque Eagle River. Among those paying closer attention than most was Olivia Parker, whose 3rd grade classroom at Pinecrest Elementary School sat less than a quarter mile from the river's edge. Olivia had built her reputation as an educator who went beyond standard curriculum, incorporating environmental awareness and practical safety skills into her teaching. Her students didn't just learn reading and arithmetic, they understood weather patterns, recognized warning signs in nature, and knew basic emergency protocols. The children deserved to understand the world around them, not just pass standardized tests, she often explained to parents who questioned her unorthodox additions to the curriculum. In Montana, respecting nature's power isn't optional, it's survival. Olivia had moved to Pinecrest 6 years earlier from Minneapolis, abandoning a promising but unfulfilling position as a corporate trainer. The transition hadn't been easy. Her parents, both successful attorneys, viewed her career change as throwing away her expensive education. Her fiancé, Mark, had refused to leave his architectural firm, ultimately choosing his career over their relationship. But Olivia had remained resolute, drawn to the mountains by something she could never fully articulate, a calling that only found expression in guiding young minds in this small community. Some people are born with mountains in their soul, her grandmother Eleanor had told her before her passing. A former park ranger in Yellowstone during the 1970s, she had recognized in her granddaughter the same connection to wilderness that had shaped her own life. It was her small trust fund that had helped Olivia purchase the modest cabin situated on 3 acres bordering national forest land that she now called home. The cabin stood 2 miles from the nearest neighbor, a sturdy structure of pine and river rock with solar panels that powered her essential appliances and educational technology. A wood stove provided heat during the brutal winters and a well-delivered fresh water year-round. To many of her colleagues, the isolation seemed extreme. To Olivia, it offered the perfect balance between community engagement and the solitude. She needed to recharge after days spent with energetic 8-year-olds. The cabin's walls displayed evidence of her dual passions, framed student artwork alongside her own photographs of local wildlife and landscapes. While teaching was her profession, photography had become her meditation, a practice that forced her to slow down and truly see the world rather than simply moving through it. Her images captured the changing seasons, wildlife in their natural habitats, and the dynamic moods of the river that now threatened the valley. Among her current students, 5 held a special place in her heart and concerns. The Harris siblings, twins Jason and James 9, Emma 8, Lily 7 and Michael 6, had lost both parents 18 months earlier in a highway pileup during a winter storm. With no known relatives able or willing to take them, the siblings had been placed together in Pinecrest's only group home, Blue Spruce Haven, run by the kind but overwhelmed Montgomery family. What made the Harris children remarkable wasn't just their tragic circumstance, but their extraordinary resilience and their unwavering commitment to staying together. The court-appointed guardian had made it clear that finding a placement for all 5 siblings was nearly impossible, yet they maintained an unbreakable bond. The older boys, Jason and James, had become unofficial protectors of their younger siblings, while Emma had assumed many of the nurturing responsibilities despite being only 8 years old. Olivia had taken special interest in their situation, volunteering extra time to help with homework, attending their case review meetings, and even considering whether her modest cabin could possibly accommodate 5 additional souls, a thought that both terrified and compelled her. She hadn't taken concrete steps toward fostering or adoption, but the possibility haunted her quiet evenings as she graded papers by the wood stove. "These children need stability more than anything," she had explained to Principal Diane Walker during a recent review meeting. "They've lost everything familiar except each other. Our responsibility goes beyond their academic progress." The Saturday morning when everything changed had begun like many others. Olivia had risen early, checking the weather report that noted continued heavy rainfall in the mountains and a flash flood watch, not yet a warning, for the Eagle River watershed. She'd planned to use the morning to prepare lesson plans before volunteering at Blue Spruce Haven in the afternoon, where she would help the Harris children with their weekend studies. The first sign that this day would be different came at 7:42 a.m. when her phone chimed with an emergency alert. "Flash flood warning. Eagle River Basin. Seek higher ground immediately. Catastrophic flooding expected." Moments later, Mrs. Montgomery called from Blue Spruce Haven, her voice tight with controlled panic. "The evacuation center at the high school is already full, and we've been redirected to the church in Highland Park," she explained. But the Harris children were on an overnight nature program at Eagle Point Education Center with Ranger Stevens. "We can't reach them. Cell service is down in that area. The center is right on the river, Olivia." Olivia's mind immediately calculated distances and elevation. Eagle Point sat 5 miles upstream, directly in the path of whatever wall of water was currently forming in the mountains above them. The education center had been built on what normally was a safe bluff, but with the ground already saturated from weeks of rain, landslides were as much a threat as the water itself. "I'll check on them," Olivia said, already moving toward her closet where her hiking gear was stored. "You focus on getting everyone else to safety. I know that area well." What she didn't add was that the road to Eagle Point likely would be the first to flood, cutting off conventional evacuation routes. Mrs. Montgomery's relief was palpable. "Thank you, Olivia. Please be careful." They were staying in the north cabin with Ranger Stevens. Should be 16 children total. As Olivia gathered emergency supplies, first aid kit, water purification tablets, energy bars, rain gear, emergency blankets, flashlight, satellite phone, and the detailed topographical maps she used for photography expeditions. She tried Ranger Stevens' number repeatedly with no success. The weather radar on her emergency radio showed a massive storm system stalled over the mountain headwaters, dumping unprecedented rainfall into an already swollen watershed. She made one final call to the County Emergency Management Office, informing them of her destination and the children potentially at risk. "We have rescue teams mobilizing, but primary focus is on the town center and assisted living facility," the dispatcher explained. "We'll add Eagle Point to the list, but it might be hours before anyone can reach that area." "I understand," Olivia replied, knowing that in disasters, resources always went where they could save the most lives. 5 children at a remote education center wouldn't be the priority when hundreds of lives were at stake in more populated areas. As she secured her cabin and climbed into her Jeep Wrangler, Olivia glanced at the western sky, where dark clouds had formed an ominous wall. The emergency radio crackled, with reports of the river already overtopping its banks in the upper valley. A meteorologist's voice explained that an atmospheric river event combined with rapid snowmelt had created the perfect conditions for a flood of historic proportions. Olivia calculated her route, knowing the main road would likely be impassable. There was an old Forest Service fire road that ran along the ridge line, connecting with the back entrance to Eagle Point. It would be rough going even in her trail-ready Jeep, but it might remain above the floodwaters long enough for her to reach the children. What she couldn't have known, as she navigated the increasingly treacherous roads, windshield wipers struggling against the intensifying downpour, was that miles away, a solitary hunter had also heard the emergency alerts. Mason Reed, tracking a wounded elk through the high country, had immediately abandoned his hunt when his satellite messenger displayed the warning. His instinct wasn't just to seek his own safety, but to patrol the backcountry routes he knew better than anyone. Paths where stranded hikers or campers might need assistance beyond what official rescue teams could provide. Neither Olivia nor Mason could have anticipated how their paths would intersect, or the long-buried connections that would be revealed when crisis stripped away the ordinary barriers between strangers. As Olivia's Jeep bounced over the increasingly muddy fire road, her thoughts remained focused solely on reaching 5 children who had already lost too much, children she was determined would not be claimed by the rising waters of a river pushed beyond its boundaries by forces beyond human control. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The Forest Service road deteriorated rapidly as Olivia pushed deeper into the wilderness. What had begun as a rough but passable route soon became a treacherous obstacle course of fallen branches, growing puddles, and increasingly unstable terrain. 3 miles from Eagle Point Education Center, disaster struck. As the Jeep rounded a sharp bend, Olivia confronted a newly formed river cutting directly across the road. Runoff from the saturated hillside above had carved a channel 4 feet wide and growing by the minute. She calculated her options quickly. Attempt to cross the flow and risk being swept away, backtrack to find another route and lose precious time, or continue on foot through terrain she knew would only become more dangerous as the storm intensified. The decision crystallized when her emergency radio crackled with an update that chilled her more than the rain soaking through her jacket. Eagle River Dam, showing signs of structural compromise. All personnel evacuate immediately. Repeat, possible. The dam failure imminent. The Eagle River Dam, built in the 1960s primarily for hydroelectric power, sat just 2 miles upstream from Eagle Point. If it failed, a wall of water would sweep away everything in its path, including the education center, and everyone inside it. There was no time for alternative routes. Olivia secured her Jeep on high ground, transferred essential supplies to her backpack, and programmed her last known coordinates into her satellite phone, sending them to emergency services with a brief message: proceeding on foot to Eagle Point. 5 children in danger. Will update when possible. The hiking path that paralleled the fire road offered slightly higher ground, but deteriorating visibility as the rain intensified. Olivia's years exploring these mountains proved invaluable now. She recognized landmarks that would have been invisible to less experienced eyes and identified dangerous zones where saturated slopes might give way. "Keep moving, just keep moving," she repeated to herself, a mantra against the growing roar of water all around her. Her photographer's eye, trained to notice details, caught the subtle signs of wildlife fleeing higher. Deer moving in unusual numbers, a family of raccoons huddled beneath an overhanging rock, birds flying in disorganized patterns, unlike their usual formations. When animals evacuate, humans should follow, her grandmother had taught her. The natural world often senses disaster before our instruments can measure it. Olivia pushed forward, ignoring the burning in her legs and the growing weight of her waterlogged clothing. The path narrowed as it climbed, providing some relief from the water pooling in lower areas, but exposing her to strengthening wind that threatened her balance with each gust. Fallen trees created barricades she had to navigate around or climb over, each obstacle consuming precious minutes as the invisible countdown to potential dam failure continued. 90 minutes into her trek, with Eagle Point theoretically less than a mile away, Olivia confronted the most significant barrier yet. A freshly triggered landslide had taken out a 30-foot section of the path, leaving a gaping wound in the hillside that dropped steeply to a swollen creek bed 50 feet below. Going around would require backtracking nearly half a mile to find a navigable contour. "No time," she muttered, surveying the damage. Using her trekking poles for stability, Olivia began picking her way across the slide zone, testing each foothold, before committing her weight, using exposed tree roots and stable rocks as anchors. Halfway across, the ground beneath her right foot gave way without warning. She plunged knee-deep into the mud, the sudden movement sending a cascade of smaller rocks tumbling down the slope. For several terrifying seconds, Olivia couldn't tell if the entire section would give way, taking her with it. She froze, distributing her weight as evenly as possible while the mud settled around her trapped leg. Only when the miniature avalanche below subsided did she dare to move, carefully extracting her leg and crawling the remaining distance to solid ground. The encounter had cost her more than time. Her right ankle throbbed from being wrenched in the mud, and her boot had filled with water and debris. Stopping to address it properly would burn precious minutes she didn't have. Assess later, move now, she told herself, pushing through the pain as she limped forward at the fastest pace she could manage. When Eagle Point Education Center finally came into view through the curtain of rain, Olivia's momentary relief curdled instantly into fresh dread. The normally picturesque complex of log buildings set on a wooded bluff now sat as an island in a rapidly expanding lake. The river had already overtopped its banks, consuming the lower parking areas and maintenance buildings. The main lodge and educational cabins, built on slightly higher ground, remained above water for now, but the access road had disappeared completely beneath the murky flood. More alarming still was the complete absence of activity. No staff directing evacuations, no vehicles attempting to leave, no visible movement of any kind. Had they already evacuated, or were they trapped inside, perhaps without full awareness of the danger approaching from upstream? Olivia cupped her hands around her mouth. "Hello, Ranger Stevens!" Her voice, stolen by the wind and rain almost immediately, seemed pathetically inadequate against the growing roar of water. She tried her phone again. Still no signal. The satellite phone showed connection, but when she attempted to call the center's emergency line, it went unanswered. There was only one way to know for certain. Descending toward the complex required careful navigation of the now saturated slope. Twice she slipped, sliding several feet before managing to arrest her momentum by grabbing exposed roots or saplings. By the time she reached level ground, the water already touched the soles of her boots, the flood continuing its relentless rise minute by minute. Olivia pushed toward the north cabin, where Mrs. Montgomery had said the Harris children would be. Staying, the wooden walkways connecting the buildings had become increasingly dubious bridges above the rising water. Some sections had already detached, floating free and creating deceptive paths that led nowhere. The door to North Cabin was locked when she reached it, but a light shone dimly through the windows. Olivia pounded on the door. "Ranger Stevens! Jason James! It's Miss Parker!" The response came not from inside, but from behind her, a child's voice barely audible above the storm. "Miss Parker, we're in the main lodge." Turning, Olivia spotted Emma Harris, waving frantically from the central building 50 yards away. The girl stood in the doorway, her small figure backlit by interior lights, clearly terrified, but somehow holding herself together. "Stay there!" Olivia shouted, already calculating the safest route across the increasingly flooded grounds. The most direct path had disappeared underwater entirely. The longer route following the elevated walkways remained mostly above water, but included sections that looked increasingly unstable. No choice, she thought, stepping onto the nearest walkway section and testing its stability before committing. Her full weight. The wood creaked ominously beneath her, waterlogged and straining against its moorings. Olivia moved as quickly as she dared, knowing that each minute increased the risk of catastrophic dam failure upstream. Halfway to the main lodge, disaster struck. A surge of water, perhaps from a newly breached section of riverbank, swept across the grounds with enough force to lift an entire section of walkway. The wooden platform tilted sharply, dumping Olivia into thigh-deep ice-cold water before she could grab the handrail. The current immediately tried to pull her away from the lodge, toward the submerged parking area, and beyond that, the fully flooded river channel. Only her quick reaction, lunging forward to grasp a still-anchored section of railing, prevented her from being swept away. The shock of cold water stole her breath momentarily as she fought against the pull, her boots seeking purchase on ground she couldn't see. With strength born of desperation, Olivia hauled herself forward through the water, fighting both the current and the weight of her waterlogged clothing. Emma had disappeared from the doorway, hopefully to get help rather than being drawn into danger herself. When Olivia finally dragged herself onto the lodge's covered porch, she discovered why no evacuation had been visible from her approach. The scene inside was one of contained chaos. Ranger Beth Stevens, a normally unflappable woman in her 50s, worked rapidly to organize 23 children and 3 junior counselors. Emergency lights cast harsh shadows across worried faces as Beth used a whiteboard to assign each older child responsibility for a younger one. "Olivia," Beth exclaimed, momentarily pausing her organization efforts. "How did you—" "Never mind. We lost phone service hours ago. Radio too. The bus never arrived for evacuation." Olivia quickly spotted the Harris siblings huddled together near a fireplace where a blaze offered inadequate warmth against the growing chill. "Beth, the dam upstream is showing signs of failure," she said quietly, not wanting to spark panic among the children. "We need to get to higher ground immediately." Beth's expression hardened as she processed this information. "The access roads been underwater for nearly an hour. We moved everyone from the lower cabins here while waiting for emergency services, but—" She gestured helplessly at the children. "Most are too young to hike out through the forest, especially in these conditions." Olivia did a quick assessment. 23 children, ranging from 6 to 12 years old, 3 teenage counselors who looked nearly as frightened as their charges, herself with an increasingly painful ankle, and Beth. No vehicles accessible, The closest high ground, a steep half-mile climb through slick, storm-ravaged forest. "We need to get to the old fire tower," Olivia said, indicating the ridge visible through the windows when lightning momentarily illuminated the landscape. "It's the highest point within reach." Beth nodded grimly. "We have emergency packs ready for each child. We were hoping the helicopter rescue they promised would reach us first, but—" she glanced at her watch. "That was 2 hours ago." As they quickly finalized an evacuation plan, a deafening crack of thunder, or what they initially thought was thunder, shook the building. The lights flickered once, twice, then failed completely. Through the large windows facing upstream, they witnessed the beginning of their worst nightmare. A surge of water, darker and more powerful than the already catastrophic flood, began moving through the valley toward them. The dam had failed. They had minutes, perhaps only seconds, before the full force would hit the education center. As the children's frightened cries filled the darkened lodge, Olivia made eye contact with Beth across the room. Both women recognized the same truth. Their path to survival had just narrowed dramatically, and 27 lives now depended on decisions they would make in the next crucial moments. 2 miles away on the eastern ridge, Mason Reed lowered, his binoculars, his experienced eyes having caught the telltale surge of the dam breach. Without hesitation, he altered his course, heading directly toward the education center at a pace few could match on this treacherous terrain. The hunting skills that had made him a legend among local guides, tracking, route finding, and reading the land's hidden signatures, were now repurposed for a far more urgent hunt. What he didn't yet know was that among the children whose lives hung in the balance were 5 who shared his blood, 5 orphans who had been told their entire extended family was either dead or unwilling to claim them. As Mason moved with preternatural speed through the storm-lashed forest, the truth that had been buried beneath years of estrangement and miscommunication was about to surface in the most unexpected way possible. "Everyone to the 2nd floor, now." Beth's command cut through the children's frightened cries. Years of running wilderness education had honed her crisis voice to something that bypassed fear and triggered immediate compliance. The children moved en masse toward the central staircase, guided by counselors who maintained a fragile calm despite their own terror. Olivia made straight for the Harris siblings. "Stay together," she instructed, helping 6-year-old Michael onto his feet. The youngest Harris child had always been quiet, but now his silence carried the weight of understanding beyond his years. His wide eyes fixed on Olivia with absolute trust that tightened her chest with a responsibility more profound than anything in her teaching career. "What about the dam?" James asked, his 9-year-old voice steady despite the tremor in his hands as he gripped his twin brother's sleeve. The perceptive child had clearly overheard enough to understand their situation. "We're moving to higher ground," Olivia answered, choosing honesty without panic. "The 2nd floor is just the first step. I need you older ones to help with the younger children." As they ascended the stairs, Olivia noticed Jason, the more protective of the twins, performing a head count of his siblings, a habit he'd developed after their parents' death, as if constant vigilance could prevent further loss. Emma, only 8 but carrying herself like a much older child, had already taken Lily's hand and was whispering reassurances to her younger sister. The lodge's 2nd floor consisted primarily of classroom spaces, offices, and a large storage area for educational materials. The windows here offered an elevated but increasingly horrifying view of the approaching surge. The initial wave from the dam breach had hit the lower sections of the property, sweeping away outbuildings with terrifying ease. The water now churned. Around the main lodge's 1st floor, debris battering against the structure with each surge. Beth quickly organized the group into the largest classroom, where emergency supplies had been stockpiled. "The building was constructed to withstand flooding," she explained to Olivia as they distributed emergency blankets, "but not a dam breach. We have 20 minutes, maybe less, before the water compromises the structural integrity. The roof, Olivia suggested, glancing upward. Beth shook her head. Too exposed in this lightning, and helicopter rescue would be impossible in these winds. She spread out a topographical map on a table, anchoring the corners with flashlights. If we can reach Sentinel Ridge, we'd be well above any possible flood level. Both women knew what remained unspoken. Reaching the ridge meant traversing nearly half a mile of terrain that was rapidly disappearing beneath the floodwaters, crossing a creek that had likely become a raging torrent, and climbing a steep slope in darkness with 23 children. There's an equipment shed on the east side with an emergency raft, Beth continued. If we can reach it, we could ferry the smallest children across the worst of the flooding to reach the trailhead. A tremendous crash from below interrupted their planning. The flood surge had broken through the lodge's main doors. Water began pouring into the first floor at an alarming rate, the building groaning under the assault of water and debris. No time for the raft, Olivia decided, her instincts crystallizing into certainty. The northwest corner has the highest ground. If we can reach the caretaker's cottage, we'd be above this initial surge and closer to the ridge trail. Beth nodded. Sharply, trust passing between the two women without need for debate. They'd known each other for years through outdoor education workshops, each recognizing the other's wilderness competence. Children. Beth's voice carried above the storm noise. We're moving to higher ground. Everyone find your buddy. Counselors, prepare to carry anyone under 7. Olivia returned to the Harris siblings. Jason, James, I need you to be my assistants. Each of you help one younger sibling. I'll take Michael. The twins nodded, with the solemn seriousness that had become their hallmark since losing their parents. Emma automatically took Lily's hand, their sibling coordination a painful reminder of all they'd already endured. The evacuation path from the second floor required navigating to the northwest fire escape, a metal staircase that led to a maintenance walkway theoretically above the floodline. Beth led the way, a powerful emergency lantern cutting through the darkness. The 3 teenage counselors positioned themselves strategically throughout the line of children, while Olivia took the rear position, Michael clinging to her back with arms wrapped tightly around her neck. The fire escape door revealed a scene from a nightmare. Rain whipped horizontally in the powerful wind as lightning strobed across the ravaged landscape. The walkway remained above water, but only by a few feet, the flood still visibly rising. In the distance, trees toppled as saturated soil gave way under the combined assault of water and wind. Stay low, hold the railing, move quickly but carefully, Beth instructed as she led the first children onto the exposed walkway. The metal surface, slick with rain, required careful navigation. The group moved with agonizing slowness, each child tentatively following the one ahead. Halfway to the caretaker's cottage, disaster struck. A massive section of debris, what appeared to be an entire shed roof, swept downstream and collided with the support pillars beneath the walkway. The entire structure shuddered, tilting several degrees toward the churning water below. "Run!" Beth shouted, abandoning caution for speed as the walkway began to fail. The children broke into a chaotic sprint, the older ones pulling younger companions forward as the metal beneath them groaned and twisted. Olivia, at the rear with Michael still clinging to her back, saw the failure point spreading toward her, metal bolts popping from their moorings as the walkway began to separate from the main building. The Harris siblings were just ahead of her, Emma struggling to keep Lily moving as the 7-year-old froze in terror. "Keep going!" Olivia shouted to the twins, who had instinctively stopped to wait for their sisters. "Get to solid ground!" She lunged forward, grabbing Lily with her. Free arm, while Emma maintained her grip on her sister's hand. Together, they pulled the terrified child forward as the walkway section behind them tore away completely, crashing into the floodwaters with a horrifying splash. The final 10 yards became a desperate race against structural failure. Olivia could You feel each section giving way almost beneath her feet as she pushed the Harris girls ahead of her, Michael's weight on her back throwing off her balance with each step. When they finally stumbled onto the relatively solid ground surrounding the caretaker's cottage, she allowed herself one quick gasp of relief before focusing on the next challenge. Beth had already organized the other children into the cottage, a two-story structure built on a slight rise specifically to serve as a refuge during normal flooding events. Its construction was more robust than the decorative log buildings of the main campus, with a concrete foundation and reinforced first floor. "Head count," Beth called, as Olivia ushered the Harris siblings through the door. Each counselor reported their assigned children, confirming that all 23 had made the crossing before the walkway's complete failure. "We can't stay here," Beth said, gesturing Olivia toward a window facing the ridge. "Look." From this vantage point, Olivia could see what Beth had already recognized. The land between the cottage and higher ground was rapidly disappearing. What had been a gentle slope leading to the forest was now transforming into an extension of the floodplain, water finding new channels with each passing minute. "If we wait any longer, we'll be cut off completely," Olivia agreed. Her ankle throbbed mercilessly, but she pushed the pain aside, focusing on the map Beth had spread on the cottage's kitchen table. "There's a maintenance trail that switchbacks up the ridge," Beth indicated. "It's steeper than the main trail, but shorter, and should be above the floodline after the first 100 yards. The group reorganized quickly. Children were paired, more strategically now, with the strongest helping the weakest. Emergency supplies were redistributed to even the load among the older participants. Beth's wilderness training program had always emphasized practical skills. Now those lessons were proving literally life-saving as the children efficiently prepared for the difficult journey ahead. Olivia checked her satellite phone one last time before departure. Still no response from emergency services, who were undoubtedly overwhelmed throughout the county. They were on their own. The exit from the caretaker's cottage to the maintenance trail required crossing approximately 50 yards of increasingly flooded ground. Beth led the way with a rope, creating a guideline for the children to follow. The water, already knee-deep on the adults, rushed with concerning force even in this relatively protected area. "Hold the rope. Don't look at the water. Focus on the person ahead of you," Beth instructed as the first children entered the flood. The smallest were carried by the teenage counselors, their faces set in determined masks beyond their years. Harris siblings moved as a unit, the twins creating a human chain with their younger sisters between them. Olivia followed with Michael, who had refused to be carried by anyone else. The 6-year-old's trust was a burden and strength simultaneously. His unwavering belief that Miss Parker would keep him safe somehow, making her more capable than she felt. The crossing seemed to take hours, though it lasted perhaps 10 minutes. When they finally reached the relative safety of the maintenance trail's start, Olivia looked back to see the caretaker's cottage, partially submerged, the walkway completely gone, and the main lodge now an island in a sea of churning brown water. Their escape had come with mere minutes to spare. The maintenance trail presented new challenges, a steep, switchbacking path now transformed into a series of muddy slides by the relentless rain. Progress slowed to a painstaking crawl, as each section required careful navigation, often with hands and knees engaged for stability. The children, initially bolstered by the adrenaline of immediate escape, began showing signs of exhaustion and exposure. "We need shelter, even temporarily," Olivia said to Beth when they paused at a switchback to regroup. "The smallest ones can't maintain body heat much longer in these conditions." Beth nodded grimly, her experienced eyes assessing both the children and the deteriorating weather. "There's a maintenance shed about halfway up, basic structure, but it has a roof and walls." "How long?" Olivia asked, watching as Emma tried unsuccessfully to stop shivering despite the emergency blanket wrapped around her shoulders. At this pace, 30 minutes minimum. It was another calculation of terrible choices. Continue pushing exhausted children through dangerous conditions, or risk stopping when the flood still threatened below. Before they could decide, a sound cut through the storm noise, a distinct, repeated whistle pattern that both women immediately recognized as a wilderness rescue signal. "Hello, the trail!" a deep voice called from above. A powerful flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a tall figure approximately 50 yards up the trail. "I'm coming down to you!" The man who appeared out of the darkness moved, with the assurance of someone born to mountain terrain. Dressed in full weather gear with a substantial pack, he assessed the situation instantly, his weathered face shifting from concern to focused determination. "Mason Reed," he introduced himself briefly to Beth and Olivia. "Hunting guide, heard the emergency broadcasts and was checking evacuation routes." His eyes scanned the group of children, lingering for just a moment on the Harris siblings with an expression Olivia couldn't quite interpret. "You can't continue up this trail. There's a major slide area ahead. But I know another way." Under normal circumstances, both Beth and Olivia might have questioned following a stranger's directions. But Mason's evident wilderness experience, combined with their increasingly desperate situation, made the decision straightforward. "The children can't go much further without rest and warmth," Olivia explained, gesturing to the youngest who were showing alarming signs of hypothermia. Mason nodded, already shrugging off his pack to extract additional emergency supplies. "My cabin is just over this rise, perhaps half a mile by the route I'll show you. It's well above any possible flood level, has heat, food, and emergency medical supplies." As he distributed additional emergency blankets and chemical hand warmers to the coldest children, Olivia noticed his particular attention to Michael, whose small frame shook uncontrollably despite being wrapped against her chest. "I can carry him," Mason offered, his tone gentle despite his imposing presence. "You're injured." He nodded toward her increasingly pronounced limp. Surprisingly, Michael showed no fear of the stranger, transferring to Mason's arms with unusual ease for a child normally wary of unfamiliar adults. Something in the hunter's calm confidence seemed to transcend normal stranger danger instincts. As Mason led them away from the compromised trail onto a nearly invisible game path, Olivia couldn't help but notice how naturally the Harris siblings responded to his directions, as if some unconscious recognition passed between them. What she couldn't possibly know then was that this chance encounter during catastrophe was actually the intersection of bloodlines separated by years of misunderstanding and loss, a connection that would soon reshape all their lives when the immediate crisis of survival had passed. The small procession moved with new purpose now, following the mysterious hunter toward shelter as the flood continued its destructive path through the valley below, erasing roads, buildings, and any evidence of the normal world they had inhabited just hours before. Mason Reed's cabin emerged from the storm-shrouded forest like a mirage, a sturdy two-story structure of weathered timber and stone that seemed to grow organically from the mountainside. Solar panels gleamed dully on the metal roof, despite the absence of sunlight, and a covered woodpile, large enough to outlast weeks of isolation, stood protected along the north wall. This was no weekend retreat, but a permanent dwelling designed by someone intimately familiar with wilderness living and its demands. "Inside quickly," Mason directed, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had already gained the children's trust. "Boots off in the mudroom. There's a wood stove in the main room and plenty of dry clothes upstairs." The contrast between the howling chaos outside and the cabin's ordered interior hit Olivia with almost physical force as she helped the last children through the heavy oak door. The main room centered around a large soapstone wood stove already, radiating substantial heat, suggesting Mason had left it burning when he departed for his hunting trip. Lanterns activated on their entry, revealing a space that managed to be both functional and surprisingly comfortable. Handcrafted furniture, well-stocked bookshelves, and walls decorated with what appeared to be both professionally framed nature photography and children's artwork. That incongruous detail, crayon drawings, carefully preserved under glass, registered in Olivia's mind before being pushed aside by more immediate concerns. The Harris siblings had huddled together near the wood stove, their soaked outer layers, creating expanding puddles on the hardwood floor. "Everyone needs to get out of wet clothes immediately," Beth announced, her outdoor educator experience shifting seamlessly to this new environment. "Hypothermia is our biggest concern right now." Mason had vanished briefly into what appeared to be a storage room, returning with armloads of clothing in various sizes. "These should fit most of the children," he explained, distributing items with surprising efficiency. "I keep supplies for wilderness survival courses." That explained the children's artwork, Olivia thought. He must host families for outdoor education. The mysterious hunter was becoming slightly less mysterious, though his appearance at their precise moment of need still seemed providential. The cabin's second floor contained 3 bedrooms and a surprisingly large bathroom with multiple shower stalls, again suggesting a space designed for group accommodation. Beth organized rotation shifts for the children to shower in hot water while Olivia assessed injuries. Besides her own increasingly painful ankle, several children had suffered minor cuts and bruises during their escape. More concerning were the signs of exposure, violent shivering, confusion, and in 2 cases, the alarming absence of shivering that indicated advancing hypothermia. Mason moved through these activities with practiced competence, heating water for warm drinks, distributing emergency blankets from his considerable supplies, and maintaining the wood stove at optimal temperature. Olivia noticed his particular attention to the Harris siblings, especially Michael, whose small frame had shown the most concerning signs of exposure. "He needs core rewarming," Mason said quietly to Olivia as he wrapped Michael in what appeared to be a specialized thermal blanket. "His body temperature has dropped too far for passive rewarming to be effective." Olivia watched as Mason demonstrated the technique, placing hot water bottles wrapped in towels against the major blood vessels at Michael's neck, armpits and groin while keeping the rest of his body insulated. The method was textbook wilderness. First aid for moderate hypothermia, performed with the precision of someone with medical training. "Are you a doctor?" she asked, as Mason checked Michael's pulse with practiced fingers. A shadow crossed his weathered face. "Army combat medic, 2. Tours, then wilderness medicine instructor for search and rescue." The information was delivered factually without elaboration, his focus remaining on the child. As the initial crisis management stabilized, Beth organized the children into sleeping arrangements, the main room converted to a dormitory with cushions. From furniture supplemented by sleeping bags and camping pads, from Mason's extensive equipment stores. The teenage counselors, having proven themselves remarkably capable during the evacuation, now helped settle the younger children, many of whom had begun crashing from the adrenaline that had sustained them. Olivia finally allowed herself to address her own injury, removing her boot to find her ankle swollen to nearly twice its normal size. She'd been operating on pure determination, but now that the immediate danger had passed, the pain rushed in with compensatory force. "You need that wrapped," Mason observed, appearing beside her with a comprehensive first aid kit. "Sprain or break?" "Sprain, I think. I can still bear weight." Mason knelt to examine the injury with clinical detachment. "Moderate grade 2, sprain from the presentation. You're lucky it's not worse, considering what you put it through getting those kids here." There was no judgment in his tone, just professional assessment, As he expertly wrapped her ankle with a compression bandage, Olivia took the opportunity to study him more closely. Mason Reed appeared to be in his mid-40s, with the lean, weathered build of someone who lived primarily outdoors. His movements displayed the economy of a person accustomed to conserving energy in demanding environments. But it was his eyes that commanded attention, pale blue under heavy brows, observant in a way that seemed to catalogue details automatically, missing nothing while revealing little of his own thoughts. "Thank you," she said as he secured the bandage. "Not just for this, for finding us. The children wouldn't have survived much longer in those conditions." Mason's expression shifted subtly, something unreadable passing behind those observant eyes. "I was already tracking the storm path, checking areas where people might be stranded." He glanced toward the Harris siblings, now huddled together under blankets near the wood stove. "Some things are more than coincidence." Before Olivia could ask what he meant, Beth approached with the satellite phone. "Still no response from emergency services. The county must be completely overwhelmed. Cell towers are down throughout the region," Mason confirmed. "Radio repeaters too, from what I gathered before heading out. We should prepare to be on our own for at least 48 to 72 hours. This assessment, delivered matter-of-factly, crystallized their situation. 27 people, mostly children, isolated in a remote cabin during the worst flooding in regional history. The immediate danger of drowning or exposure had passed, but new challenges of sustainment and medical care now faced them. "What's our supply situation?" Beth asked, the practical outdoor educator focusing on essentials. "Better than most," Mason replied. "I maintain 6 months of provisions minimum. Solar system with battery backup for power. Gravity-fed spring water with filtration, independent of municipal systems. Wood heat with propane backup. Basic medical. Supplies for wilderness first aid, though nothing for serious trauma beyond stabilization." Olivia and Beth exchanged glances, both recognizing how extraordinarily fortunate they had been in finding not just shelter, but perhaps the most comprehensively prepared refuge possible under the circumstances. "You live like this all the time?" Olivia asked, curiosity temporarily overriding her exhaustion. Something like amusement flickered across Mason's face. "I prefer self-sufficiency, and my work requires it." He began unpacking containers of dehydrated food from a pantry. "We should get a hot meal into everyone before they crash completely. Protein and carbohydrates for recovery." As Mason prepared a large pot of what appeared to be hearty stew on a propane cookstove, Olivia checked on the Harris siblings. The twins had positioned themselves protectively on either side of their younger brother and sisters, maintaining the formation that had become instinctive since their parents' death. All 5 showed the bone-deep exhaustion of children who had faced mortality and survived, but their physical condition had stabilized with warmth and dry clothes. "You did good looking after each other," Olivia told them quietly. "Your parents would be proud." Jason, the more vocal of the twins, looked up at her with eyes too old for his 9 years. "We promised Mom and Dad we'd always stay together no matter what." The simple statement carried the weight of months of fighting to remain a family unit when systems and statistics worked against them. "And you will," Olivia assured him, though the promise exceeded her actual authority. The uncertainty of their situation after the emergency passed remained a shadow at the edges of her thoughts. As Mason distributed bowls of steaming stew, Olivia noticed again his particular attention to the Harris children, making sure they received the first servings, checking that the portion sizes matched their different ages, quietly encouraging Michael to eat despite the boy's obvious exhaustion. The care seemed instinctive rather than calculated, and the children responded to him with surprising ease. After the meal, with most of the children settled into sleep despite the continuing storm outside, Mason finally allowed himself to sit at the large oak table where Olivia and Beth had been conferring over maps of the region, the valleys completely transformed. he told them, tracing the river's normal course with a calloused finger. "Based on what I observed before finding, the main road's gone in at least 8 places. The secondary evacuation route to the east is compromised by landslides. The bridge at Franklin's Crossing was underwater when I passed it 3 hours ago, likely swept away by now." The assessment confirmed what they had already suspected. They were effectively cut off from the outside world until either floodwaters receded enough for ground evacuation or emergency services regained sufficient capacity for helicopter extraction. "We have 23 children and 3 teenagers," Beth said. 5 with signs of mild hypothermia, though improving, 2 with minor injuries requiring monitoring, everyone exhausted and traumatized to varying degrees. "Plus your sprained ankle," Mason added, nodding toward Olivia, "and limited medication supplies for anything beyond basic first aid." His assessment wasn't pessimistic, merely factual. The clear-eyed evaluation of someone accustomed to cataloging challenges before addressing them. "We're alive," Olivia said simply. "This morning, that outcome wasn't guaranteed." Mason studied her with renewed interest, those observant eyes, noting something beyond her physical state. "You got 5 children across flood terrain with a significant ankle injury, then helped evacuate 23 more up a mountain in hurricane conditions. That's not standard teacher training." Despite her exhaustion, Olivia smiled slightly. "I spent summers as a wilderness guide to pay for college, and my grandmother was a park ranger who believed formal education was incomplete without survival skills." This information seemed to satisfy something in Mason's assessment. He nodded once, decision apparently made. "You should both get some rest. I'll take first watch. The storm's still capable of creating new threats, and someone should monitor the children showing hypothermia symptoms." Beth, clearly reaching her physical limits after hours of crisis management, accepted the suggestion gratefully. She arranged herself on a pad near the main cluster of children, her outdoor educator instincts keeping her positioned where she could respond quickly if needed. Olivia intended to follow suit, her body screaming for rest, but found herself instead moving to check on the Harris siblings once more. All 5 appeared to be sleeping, but as she approached, Emma's eyes opened with the immediate alertness of a child accustomed to vigilance. "Miss Parker?" the 8-year-old whispered. "Is Mr. Reed going to make us leave when the flood is over?" The question caught Olivia off guard. "Of course not. He's helping us until emergency services can reach us." Emma studied her teacher with surprising intensity. "He looks at us differently, like he knows us." Before Olivia could respond to this perceptive observation, Mason appeared beside them, carrying another blanket. "The temperature's dropping outside," he said quietly, draping the additional covering over the 5 siblings. His hand lingered briefly on Michael's head, in a gesture so naturally protective that it seemed almost parental. Emma watched this with the same analytical gaze that had impressed Olivia since the girl first entered her classroom. Something was connecting between the child's observation and Mason's behavior, but Olivia's exhausted mind couldn't quite grasp the pattern forming before her. "You should rest," Mason told Olivia, his voice dropping to ensure they didn't disturb the sleeping children. "Tomorrow will bring new challenges once the initial shock wears off." As Olivia finally surrendered to her body's demands for sleep, finding space on a camping pad near the Harris siblings, her last conscious thought was of Emma's perceptive question and Mason's protective gesture toward children he had supposedly just met. There was a mystery here beyond their miraculous rescue, a connection she was still too exhausted to unravel, but which hung in the cabin's warm air like a whispered conversation just below the threshold of hearing. Outside, the storm continued, its assault on the mountain, but within the cabin's sturdy walls, 27 survivors had found not just shelter, but something that already felt remarkably like sanctuary. What none of them yet realized was that forces beyond the weather had been set in motion years earlier, forces that had brought a specific hunter to a specific mountainside at precisely the moment 5 specific orphans needed rescue. The revelation of those connections would come with the morning light, changing all their lives in ways none could anticipate as they surrendered to exhausted sleep. Morning arrived not with sunlight, but with a subtle lessening of the storm's fury. The rain continued, but the violent wind had diminished to occasional gusts rather than constant assault. Olivia woke to the smell of coffee and the quiet murmur of children's voices, subdued compared to normal classroom energy, but reassuringly normal after yesterday's terror. She found Mason in the kitchen area, efficiently preparing breakfast for 27 people, as if this were a routine occurrence. Several of the older children had organized themselves as helpers, setting out plates and cups under his quiet direction. The Harris twins, Jason and James, seemed particularly engaged, following Mason's instructions with unusual attentiveness. "How's the ankle?" Mason asked, noticing her wakeful presence immediately despite being occupied with multiple tasks. Olivia tested her weight carefully. Stiff but functional, the swellings down. She accepted the mug of coffee he offered, the warmth spreading through her hands like a tangible reminder of safety. "I've been checking weather updates on the emergency radio," Mason informed her, nodding toward a sophisticated communications setup in the corner. "The worst of the storm has moved east, but we're looking at another 24-48 hours of steady rain. The flooding is catastrophic throughout the county. Bridges down, roads washed out, communication systems compromised." This matched what Olivia had expected, but hearing it confirmed still sent a cold sensation through her chest that had nothing to do with the cabin's morning chill. "Have you been able to contact emergency services?" Mason nodded. "Made radio contact with the County Emergency Management Center about an hour ago. They've documented our location and status. We're on the rescue list, but they're prioritizing medical emergencies and areas where infrastructure failure threatens additional casualties. Realistically, we're looking at 3 to 5 days before they can reach us, assuming conditions don't worsen." Beth joined them, looking remarkably put together despite the circumstances. Her wilderness educator training had clearly instilled habits that translated well to extended emergency situations. "The children?" she asked simply. "All stable," Mason replied. "The 5 showing hypothermia symptoms have normalized. 2 with mild dehydration I'm addressing with electrolyte solutions. Everyone's physically exhausted, but recovering. Psychologically," he shrugged slightly. "That's harder to assess." Olivia had been watching the Harris siblings, who had stationed themselves near the large windows overlooking the valley below. The transformation of the landscape was shocking. Where there had once been distinct features of forest, meadow and riverbed, now there existed only a vast brown lake dotted with the occasional roof or treetop. "They've lost everything before," she said quietly. "This will trigger that trauma." Mason's expression shifted subtly, something Olivia was beginning to recognize as his tell when personal feelings broke through his carefully maintained professional demeanor. "They're resilient," he said, his gaze following hers to the 5 siblings, "more than anyone should need to be at their age." There was a knowledge in his tone that struck Olivia as peculiar, as if he understood these specific children's resilience, rather than making a general observation about youth. The pattern Emma had noted last night surfaced again in Olivia's mind, but before she could pursue it, practical matters intervened. The day organized itself around basic necessities: meal preparation, medical monitoring, activities to occupy traumatized children, and regular check-ins with emergency services. Mason's cabin proved remarkably well equipped for their needs, with everything from board games and books to art supplies and basic educational materials. "You really do run wilderness education programs here?" Olivia observed as she helped Mason distribute paper and colored pencils to the younger children. Beth had organized the teenagers and older kids in an inventory of supplies, a practical activity that doubled as therapeutic engagement. "Not formally," Mason replied, hesitating before continuing. "I designed the space with children in mind, but circumstances changed before I could implement those plans." This was the first personal information he'd volunteered, and Olivia recognized it as significant despite its vagueness. The cabin clearly reflected both thoughtful preparation and a specific intention that remained unfulfilled. The children's artwork on the walls, she now realized, wasn't from previous visitors, but preserved mementos of some kind. As morning progressed toward afternoon, Olivia noticed Mason increasingly gravitating toward the Harris siblings. His interactions remained appropriate, but carried an intensity of focus that stood out. He listened to James describe their escape from the education center with complete attention, asked Jason thoughtful questions about his interest in topographical maps, and showed Emma how to properly use the high-powered binoculars to monitor the flooding below. Most telling was his interaction with 6-year-old Michael, who had remained nearly silent since their arrival. When the young boy finally approached Mason with a hesitant question about a bird visible through the window, Mason knelt to eye level and answered with the same seriousness he might offer an adult, then gently guided the child's hands to hold the binoculars properly. The interaction had the quality of something long rehearsed but never performed, natural yet significant. Olivia's observations were interrupted when Beth pulled her aside, expression troubled. "We need to check our head count again," she said quietly. "I'm coming up one short on the youngest group." A quick survey of the main room confirmed Beth's concern. Lily Harris, the quiet 7-year-old, was missing from the siblings' usual tight formation. Jason and James had noticed as well, their faces showing the immediate alarm of children too familiar with loss. "When did you last see her?" Olivia asked Emma, who had appointed herself the primary caretaker of her younger sister since their parents' death. "She was drawing at the table," Emma said, her voice tight with controlled panic. "Then she said she needed to use the bathroom. That was maybe 20 minutes ago." Mason, overhearing, immediately organized a systematic search of the cabin's main floor, checking closets, under furniture, and in storage spaces where a small child might unintentionally become trapped. When this yielded nothing, the search expanded to the second floor, with Beth and one of the teenage counselors checking bedrooms and bathroom spaces. "Nothing upstairs," Beth reported upon returning, the concern now evident in her voice. Mason's expression had shifted from methodical to genuinely worried, his eyes constantly moving to the windows where the storm continued unabated. "There's a basement level," he said. "Storage and mechanical systems. The door should be locked, but—" He didn't complete the sentence, already moving toward a heavy wooden door partially concealed behind a bookcase. The door was indeed locked, but a small key, normally kept on a high hook beside it, was missing. Mason's face tightened as he retrieved a spare key from his desk drawer and quickly unlocked the door. Cool air wafted up from the darkened stairway beyond. "Lily?" he called down, his voice gentler than Olivia had heard him use before. "Are you down there, sweetheart?" A small sniffle echoed from below, not frightened, but the sound of someone trying to conceal tears. Mason glanced at Olivia with a look that communicated a request for privacy, but Jason and James had already pushed forward, their protective instincts overriding any adult direction. "Wait," Mason said quietly to the twins. "Let me go first." The stairs are steep. The basement revealed itself as a surprisingly large space, well organized with storage shelves, a workshop area, and mechanical systems for the cabin's off-grid functionality. Mason led them unerringly toward a corner, partially concealed by supply shelves, where Lily sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by objects she had clearly removed from a large wooden trunk. The scene crystallized for Olivia in a single moment of clarity. Lily surrounded by family photographs, small toys, and children's drawings. One picture in particular lay in the girl's lap, a family portrait showing a man and woman with 5 younger versions of the Harris siblings. "That's Mom and Dad," Lily said simply, looking up at Mason with tear-stained cheeks. "Why do you have their picture?" The room seemed to hold its breath as Mason knelt beside the child, his usual composed expression replaced by something raw and unguarded. "Because they were important to me too," he said softly. "Your father was my brother." The revelation landed like a physical presence in the room. The twins exchanged shocked glances while Emma stepped forward, her analytical gaze moving between Mason's face and the photograph with newfound recognition. "Your Uncle Mason," she said, not a question but a confirmation of something she'd already begun to piece together. "Dad's brother, who was overseas in the army. He said you couldn't come home because you were protecting people." Mason nodded, his composure visibly strained. "I was deployed when your parents died. By the time I returned and found out what happened, the system had already processed your case. I was told you'd been placed with maternal relatives in Idaho." "That's not true," Jason said, his voice carrying the righteous indignation of a child confronting adult failures. "They said we didn't have any family left. That's why they put us in the group home." Olivia watched understanding dawn on Mason's face, the realization that bureaucratic error or miscommunication had separated him from his brother's children for 18 months when they had needed family most. The emotion that crossed his features was too complex for simple categorization. Grief, anger, and relief intermingled in an expression that transformed his usual stoic demeanor. "I looked for you," he said quietly. "When I couldn't find confirmation of your placement, I hired a private investigator, but his information led to dead ends. 3 months ago, I expanded the search radius and moved here permanently to continue looking." "You've been searching for us all this time?" Emma asked, her precocious mind clearly processing the implications. "Every day," Mason confirmed. "I modified this cabin to be ready for you. A room for the boys, one for you and Lily, and a special space for Michael. I kept looking, but the records—" He trailed off, clearly unwilling to burden the children with the complexities of a system that had failed them all. Lily, who had remained quiet during these revelations, suddenly stood and wrapped her arms around Mason's neck, a gesture of pure acceptance that cut through the confusion and hurt. After a moment's hesitation, Mason returned the embrace, something in his military-trained bearing finally yielding to the simple human connection he'd been seeking for 18 months. What followed was a moment Olivia would remember with perfect clarity despite the chaos surrounding it. The 5 Harris siblings and their newly discovered uncle forming a tight circle on the basement floor, the children firing questions and Mason answering with patient honesty. Occasional tears breaking through his composure when the full extent of what they'd endured without him became clear. Olivia backed quietly toward the stairs, recognizing this reunion as something private, despite having witnessed its beginning. Beth had already retreated upstairs to maintain supervision of the other children, understanding intuitively that the Harris siblings needed this space for reconnection. As Olivia reached the stairs, Mason looked up and caught her eye. The wordless communication that passed between them acknowledged both the extraordinary circumstances that had brought them all together and the questions that would need addressing when this initial reunion concluded. Back in the main room, Beth approached with questioning eyes. "They found family photographs," Olivia explained quietly. "Mason Reed is their uncle, their father's brother. He's been searching for them since returning from military deployment after their parents' death." Beth processed this with the rapid adaptation that had made her such an effective crisis leader. That explains a lot about his behavior toward them. But how did they end up in our county's system if he was actively searching? Bureaucratic error, from what I gathered. He was told they'd been placed with maternal relatives in Idaho. The system told them they had no living relatives willing to take them. The implications hung heavily between the two women. 18 months of separation and uncertainty created by paperwork mistakes or system failures. For two professionals who worked adjacent to child services, the revelation carried additional weight. How many other children had suffered similar circumstances? When Mason emerged from the basement 30 minutes later, the Harris siblings followed in a formation that had subtly shifted from their usual defensive cluster. They still moved as a unit, but now oriented around their uncle rather than simply protecting each other. The change was small but profound. They had found an adult they instinctively trusted to help carry the burden they'd been bearing alone. "We need to talk," Mason said to Olivia and Beth, his voice steady despite the emotional earthquake he'd just experienced, "about what happens when we get out of here." In that simple statement, Olivia recognized the shifting terrain of their situation. What had been a straightforward emergency, children needing rescue from flooding, had transformed into something far more complex. The Harris siblings had found family during disaster, but integrating this discovery into the legal and social systems awaiting them below would require navigation as careful as their escape from the floodwaters. As Mason organized the children to help prepare lunch, a transparent attempt to create normalcy amid extraordinary circumstances, Olivia caught Emma watching her uncle with an expression that blended hope and wariness. The 8-year-old had shouldered responsibilities beyond her years since losing her parents, developing a protective skepticism toward adult promises. Now she observed Mason with the careful assessment of someone who desperately wanted to believe, but had learned the cost of disappointment. The storm outside had begun to slacken further, occasional breaks in the cloud cover allowing brief shafts of sunlight to illuminate the transformed landscape below. The physical danger was gradually receding, but the emotional landscape had grown more complex with each revelation. As Olivia moved to help with lunch preparations, she realized they had entered a new phase of their journey, one where the challenges wouldn't come from raging water or hypothermia, but from navigating the human systems that awaited them when rescue finally arrived. The afternoon brought subtle shifts in both weather and human dynamics within the cabin. The storm had weakened to steady rain without the violent wind that had characterized the previous day. Mason's emergency radio occasionally crackled with updates from county emergency services, reports of ongoing rescue operations, infrastructure damage assessments, and tentative timelines for reaching various isolated areas. They've prioritized medical evacuations and critical infrastructure, Mason explained to Olivia and Beth as they sat at the kitchen table, the Harris siblings within sight but beyond earshot in the main room. "Realistically, we're looking at 3 more days minimum before they can reach us, barring medical emergency." Beth nodded, her practical nature already calculating supply usage and activity planning for extended isolation. "The children are safe, fed and warm. Others need immediate help more than we do." Olivia's attention remained divided between the practical discussion and the 5 Harris siblings, who were engaged in what appeared to be an intense conversation of their own. The revelation of Mason's identity had visibly transformed their dynamic. Their usual tight formation had relaxed slightly, as if some invisible thread of tension had been cut. "We need to discuss what happens afterward," Olivia said, returning her focus to the adults, with the Harris children. Mason's expression remained carefully neutral, but his hands betrayed tension as they gripped his coffee mug. "Legally, I have documentation of my relationship and intent to petition for guardianship. I initiated the process months ago, but without knowing their actual location." He trailed off, the frustration of bureaucratic obstacles evident in his voice. "The system failed them," Olivia acknowledged. "And you, but correcting it won't be simple, even with proof of biological relationship." "I'm aware," Mason replied. "I've been corresponding with family court attorneys since returning stateside. The legal groundwork is laid. I have financial stability, appropriate housing, and clean background checks from military and civilian life. What I lacked was their location and case specifics. Beth, whose role as education center director had, given her substantial experience with child services, asked the practical questions Olivia had been considering. Have you completed foster parent certification? Home studies? The relationship helps, but the courts will still require those steps, especially for 5 children with documented trauma history. Initiated, but not completed, Mason acknowledged. The process stalled when the investigator couldn't locate the children's placement. I was attempting to work through back channels when he gestured toward the windows where the aftermath of catastrophic flooding was clearly visible. The complexity of their situation hung heavily in the air. What had seemed like miraculous resolution, orphan children discovering their long-lost uncle during a natural disaster, would still need to navigate legal systems notorious for prioritizing procedure over expediency, even when family reunification was the obvious best outcome. "I can help," Olivia offered. "I've been working with their case manager for months, considering fostering them myself." This admission clearly surprised Mason, his carefully maintained composure slipping to reveal genuine appreciation. "I have relationships with people in the system who can help expedite things." Mason studied her with those perceptive blue eyes. "Why were you considering taking them? 5 children is an enormous responsibility for a single person to assume." The question wasn't challenging, but genuinely curious. Olivia considered her answer carefully. They deserved to stay together. The system was moving towards splitting them up as more adoptable in smaller groups. I couldn't let that happen. Understanding passed between them. Recognition of a shared protective instinct toward these specific children that transcended professional responsibility. Before their conversation could continue, Jason approached the table, his 9-year-old, face set in the serious expression that had become his default since losing his parents. "We've been talking," he said, gesturing toward his siblings. "We have questions about what happens next." The directness was characteristic of Jason, who had assumed responsibilities as the eldest male in his family despite his young age. Mason nodded with equal seriousness, respecting the child's attempt to advocate for his siblings. "Of course. Why don't we all talk together?" What followed was perhaps the most extraordinary family conference Olivia had ever witnessed. The 5 Harris siblings arranged themselves in their usual formation on one side of the living area, while Mason sat, facing them, neither too close to pressure nor too distant to communicate disinterest. Olivia and Beth positioned themselves slightly apart, present for support but clearly not central to the discussion. "You want us to live with you?" Emma began, her analytical mind cutting straight to the core issue. Mason nodded. "Yes. That's been my intention since learning of your parents' deaths. I've prepared space for all of you, resources for your education and activities, and legal documentation to begin the process. Why didn't you find us sooner?" This came from James, the quieter twin, his question holding hurt rather than accusation. Mason's expression reflected his internal struggle, how to explain complex adult systems to children without burdening them with unnecessary details. "When I returned from overseas and learned what had happened, you had already been placed in the system. I was told you were with your mother's family in Idaho. That information was wrong, but discovering that took time. I've been searching for 18 months Did you know our parents well? Lily asked, her 7-year-old voice small but distinct. Something softened in Mason's face. Your father was my younger brother. We grew up together in Montana, about 100 miles from here. I was best man at your parents' wedding. I was overseas when they had each of you, but I met everyone except Michael during leaves. This information visibly impacted the children. The older ones had fragmented memories of an uncle in uniform, while Lily and Michael had no recollection at all. The gap between their lived experience and this newly revealed relationship created visible cognitive dissonance, particularly for the younger children. "Where were you when they died?" Jason asked, the question holding the unresolved grief that had characterized his adjustment to orphanhood. Mason's composure faltered slightly. "Afghanistan, my 3rd tour. I didn't learn about the accident until 3 weeks after it happened due to communication issues in remote areas. By then, the funeral had already occurred and initial placements were made." The pain in his voice was evident despite his attempt at factual delivery. "Would we have to change schools?" This practical question came from Emma, already thinking through logistics in her characteristic fashion. "Not immediately," Mason answered. "My cabin is within reasonable distance of your current school. Eventually, we might consider options. Closer to here, but I wouldn't make that change without discussing it with each of you." The questions continued. Practical concerns about bedrooms and possessions, deeper worries about separation, and hesitant inquiries about Mason himself. Throughout, Mason answered with unflinching honesty, tempered by age-appropriate explanations. When Michael finally spoke, his small voice surprising everyone after hours of silence, the question cut to the emotional core. "Did you want us before, when Mum and Dad were alive?" The question hung in the air, the 6-year-old's perception piercing. Through adult complexities to the essential fear of unwanted obligation, Mason's carefully maintained composure broke completely, genuine emotion transforming his weathered face. "Every day," he said simply, "I kept a photograph of each of you. In my quarters, your father sent me videos of birthdays and school events. I had leave scheduled for the month after they died, was planning to spend 2 weeks with all of you at a lake house we'd rented." He swallowed hard, visibly fighting for control. "Losing your parents shattered me too. Finding you has been my only purpose since returning home." The raw honesty reached the children in ways that reassurances couldn't have. Michael, who had remained physically distant throughout the conversation, slowly crossed the space separating him from Mason and climbed wordlessly onto his uncle's lap, a gesture of acceptance more powerful than any verbal response. The other siblings exchanged glances, their own unspoken communication system evidently processing this development. After a moment, Emma nodded slightly to the twins. Some decision apparently reached through their silent conference. "We want to stay together," Jason stated, the non-negotiable condition that had been their mantra since entering the system. "Always." Mason agreed without hesitation. "That's never been in question." As the extraordinary family meeting continued, Olivia found herself stepping further back, recognizing that her role had shifted fundamentally with Mason's appearance. She had been preparing herself, both practically and emotionally, to potentially become these children's guardian. That path had closed, replaced by something simultaneously better for the children and personally challenging for her to process. Later, as evening approached and the children were engaged in a board game with Beth and the teenage counselors, Mason found Olivia on the covered porch where she had stepped out to watch the rain. "Thank you," he said simply, joining her at the railing. "For what? You're the one who saved all of us." Mason shook his head slightly. "For caring for them when I couldn't find them. For being willing to take on 5 traumatized children, rather than see them separated. For creating enough stability in their lives that they could maintain hope." His gaze remained on the flooded landscape, but his words were precisely chosen. That kind of commitment goes beyond professional responsibility. Olivia absorbed this acknowledgement, recognizing the complex emotions beneath it, gratitude mixed with the grief of time lost, of moments with his brother's children he would never recover. "What will you do?" she asked. "After the legal hurdles?" A faint smile touched Mason's face. "Everything I've been planning for 18 months. Create stability, help them process their grief, learn who they've become in the time I missed, honor my brother and sister-in-law by raising their children as they would have wanted." He paused, his gaze shifting to meet hers directly. "And I'd like your help if you're willing. They trust you, that's invaluable." The request wasn't what Olivia had expected, not a polite distancing now that biological family had been found, but an invitation to remain connected to children she had come to care about deeply. The generosity of this inclusion struck her powerfully, revealing Mason's character beyond his tactical competence and protective instincts. "Of course," she said simply. "Whatever they need." Inside the cabin, Emma had paused in the board game to watch the adults on the porch, her perceptive gaze missing nothing about their interaction. When Mason and Olivia returned inside, Emma approached her teacher with uncharacteristic hesitation. "Ms. Parker, will you still be our teacher, even after we go live with Uncle Mason?" The question carried layers of meaning: concern about losing yet another stable adult, uncertainty about the transitions ahead, and the child's intuitive understanding that relationships were being renegotiated in this extraordinary circumstance. "Absolutely," Olivia assured her, kneeling despite her injured ankle to meet Emma at eye level. "Your uncle and I were just talking about that. Some things will change, but I'll still be in your life. Not just as your teacher, but as someone who cares about all of you." Emma studied her with that analytical gaze that sometimes made Olivia forget she was only 8 years old. "Promise, even if it gets complicated with grown-up stuff." "I promise," Olivia said firmly. "Some things are worth working through complications." As Emma rejoined her siblings, Mason caught Olivia's eye across the room, a silent acknowledgement, a passing between them. They had survived the immediate natural disaster, but the path ahead would require different kinds of navigation, legal systems, emotional healing, and the complex integration of past trauma with future hope. The foundation for that journey was taking shape here in the aftermath of catastrophe, connections forming that would sustain them through the challenges awaiting below the mountain when rescue finally arrived. The storm outside had diminished to gentle rain, its destructive power spent. Within the cabin, 27 survivors had begun the transition from immediate crisis to longer recovery, while 5 orphaned children and their long-lost uncle had started a healing process that would extend far beyond their eventual rescue from the flood-ravaged landscape. The second morning of their isolation brought sunshine breaking through scattered clouds, the first direct light since the catastrophic flooding began. The transformation was both physical and psychological. The oppressive darkness lifted to reveal a landscape fundamentally altered, yet beginning the long process of recovery. Water levels had visibly receded overnight, exposing rooftops and treetops that had been completely submerged. Olivia stood at the large windows, coffee warming her hands, watching as the children gathered excitedly at the glass. Their voices carried a lightness absent since the rescue, the simple joy of sunshine penetrating the trauma of recent days. "The reservoir's draining north," Mason observed, joining her with his own steaming mug. "The emergency spillways are functioning as designed now that the dam breach has stabilized." His assessment was professional, but carried undercurrents of relief. The immediate danger had passed. "What's that?" Michael asked, pointing to a distant flicker of movement across the transformed valley. Mason squinted, then retrieved his binoculars from nearby. "Helicopter," National Guard, looks like, running assessment routes. He handed the binoculars to Michael, showing the boy how to adjust them for his smaller face. The simple interaction held none of the awkwardness that might be expected between newly connected family members, Mason's natural manner with children bridging potential gaps. "When will they come for us?" Lily asked, her 7-year-old perspective focused on concrete timelines rather than abstract recovery processes. "Probably tomorrow," Mason answered honestly. "They're checking the most dangerous areas first, places where people might be injured or buildings might collapse. We're safe here, with plenty of supplies, so they'll help others before reaching us." This pragmatic explanation satisfied the children in ways that false reassurance wouldn't have. Olivia had noticed this consistent pattern in Mason's interactions with the Harris siblings, his unwavering honesty delivered with age-appropriate consideration, but never condescension. It was the approach of someone who respected children as thinking beings while protecting them from unnecessary distress. Beth had organized the other children into rotating activity groups, structured engagement that provided both distraction and necessary routine. The teenage counselors had risen admirably to leadership roles, their initial fear transformed into purposeful responsibility. One group currently worked on an elaborate mural depicting their experiences, the art therapy, serving multiple psychological functions while creating tangible documentation of their shared ordeal. "I spoke with County Emergency Management at dawn," Mason told Olivia quietly. "They've established a temporary command center at the high school gym. Most evacuees are being processed there before transfer to longer-term accommodations." He hesitated before continuing. "We need to prepare the Harris children for what happens after rescue." Olivia understood his concern immediately. The children had experienced a profound reunion with their uncle, but the bureaucratic realities awaiting them below wouldn't necessarily honor those emotional truths. Without proper documentation and preparation, they could potentially be returned to the group home pending legal proceedings, regardless of biological relationship. "Do you have any legal documentation with you?" she asked. "In my office safe," Mason confirmed. "Military records establishing my identity, birth certificates showing sibling relationship with Daniel Harris, letters from family court attorneys, and initial guardianship petition paperwork. It won't be sufficient for immediate custody transfer, but it establishes legitimate grounds for emergency kinship placement." Olivia considered this information against her knowledge of local child services procedures. "I know the district family court judge, Patricia Wilkins. She's fair and prioritizes family unification when possible. If we can get your documentation to her directly, bypassing initial intake procedures." A plan began to form between them, specific steps that might navigate the bureaucratic obstacles while maintaining the children's newfound stability. As they discussed details, Emma approached, her observant gaze making it clear she had been monitoring their conversation from a distance. "You're talking about what happens to us," she stated rather than asked, her precocious perception cutting through adult attempts at discretion. "When we go back down there." Mason and Olivia exchanged glances, silently acknowledging the futility of shielding the perceptive 8-year-old from realities that would directly impact her life. Mason gestured to a nearby chair, inviting Emma to join their conversation, rather than excluding her. "Yes," he confirmed, "we're discussing how to make sure you and your siblings can stay with me legally, without any unnecessary time back in the group home." Emma nodded, processing this with remarkable composure. "The system people might try to separate us again, even from you." The assessment displayed such adult understanding of institutional failings that Olivia felt a renewed surge of protective anger towards systems that forced children to become such experts in bureaucratic threats to their stability. "That's what we're working to prevent," Mason assured his niece. "Ms. Parker knows people who can help. I have documents proving I'm your father's brother, and we're developing a plan to make the transition as smooth as possible." Emma considered this, her young face showing the calculated assessment of someone who had learned to evaluate adult promises against hard experience. "Can I help? I keep track of important papers for us. I have our ID cards and school documents in my backpack. They got wet, but maybe they're still useful." The revelation that this 8-year-old had appointed herself keeper of essential documentation struck both adults powerfully. Emma had been carrying not just emotional responsibility for her siblings, but practical burden as well. "That's incredibly helpful," Olivia told her genuinely. "Those documents establish your identities, which is an important part of the process." Emma nodded, seemingly satisfied that her contribution had value. "I should go get them now so they can dry out more." She hesitated before adding, "And I should tell the others about the plan. They worry less when they know what's happening, even if it's complicated." After Emma departed on her self-appointed mission, Mason watched her with an expression mixing pride and sorrow. She shouldn't have had to become so responsible at her age. "No," Olivia agreed. But that responsibility helped keep them together through 18 months of instability. It's part of who she is now. The conversation expanded to include Beth when she joined them during a break in children's activities. Her experience with educational administration added valuable perspective on school transfer procedures and documentation requirements that would smooth the children's eventual transition to Mason's custody. "The documentation is important," Beth emphasized, "but equally critical is establishing continuity of support. 5 children who've experienced significant trauma need consistent therapeutic resources, educational stability, and maintenance of positive relationships they've already formed." This aligned perfectly with Mason's thinking. "I've researched trauma-informed family therapists within reasonable distance of both my cabin and their current school. My goal is minimizing disruption while providing the specialized support they need." As morning progressed toward afternoon, the Harris siblings gravitated increasingly toward their uncle, asking questions about his life, his relationship with their father, and practical aspects of potentially living at the cabin. The conversation flowed naturally between serious topics and lighter moments, the children gradually relaxing into a family dynamic that felt simultaneously new and familiar. Watching this evolution, Olivia reflected on the extraordinary circumstance that had brought them together. Had the flood not forced evacuation of the education center, had Mason not been hunting in that precise area, had any single factor in the complex chain of events changed slightly, these children might never have discovered their uncle's existence or his tireless search for them. "It's not fate," Beth said quietly, following Olivia's gaze to where Mason was showing the twins how to use a handheld weather station. "But it's not entirely random either." "What would you call it then?" "Olivia," asked Beth, considered this. "Connection persisting beyond what should logically sever it. Mason never stopped searching. The children never stopped hoping for family that would keep them together. Your protective instinct toward them created another layer of safety. All these invisible threads somehow aligned during catastrophe." This perspective resonated with Olivia's own feeling about the situation, that beneath the bureaucratic failures and system breakdowns, human connection had somehow found a way to reassert itself. The observation carried philosophical implications about resilience and relationship that transcended the immediate circumstances. The afternoon brought increased helicopter activity visible across the valley, systematic search patterns indicating the shift from initial emergency response to comprehensive recovery operations. Mason's radio communications with emergency management confirmed what these patterns suggested. Rescue teams were methodically working outward from the most severely affected areas, with their location now scheduled for evacuation the following morning, weather permitting. This timeline created both relief and anxiety. The physical threat had passed, but the next challenge, navigating the human systems awaiting them below, loomed with its own complexity. Mason took advantage of improved weather conditions to check the cabin's exterior structure and surrounding property, bringing Jason and James with him for what he framed as perimeter inspection, but clearly served as valuable one-on-one time. With the twins, Olivia found Emma and Lily in the bedroom they'd been assigned, carefully arranging their few possessions, mostly items of clothing provided by Mason, along with the salvaged family photographs from the basement trunk. Emma had created a meticulous inventory on notebook paper, her neat handwriting listing each photograph, with descriptions of who appeared in each. "That's very organized," Olivia observed, sitting carefully on the edge of the bed to avoid disturbing their arrangement. "I want Uncle Mason to know which pictures are important to us," Emma explained, "so he can help us make copies and keep them safe." The practical task held obvious emotional significance, cataloging tangible connections to parents they'd lost and family history they were just beginning to recover. Lily worked alongside her sister, handling each photograph with reverent care, despite her younger age. "Ms. Parker," Lily asked suddenly, "will you still visit us if we live with Uncle Mason?" The question carried layers of meaning about attachment, continuity, and the young girl's concept of family expanding beyond biological boundaries. Olivia recognized its importance immediately. "Absolutely," she assured both girls. "Your uncle and I have already talked about that. I'll still be your teacher, and I can visit outside school too, if that's something you'd like." Emma studied her teacher with characteristic analytical intensity. "Uncle Mason said you were thinking about taking all of us, before you knew about him." The observation wasn't quite a question, but clearly invited response. Olivia chose honesty, recognizing these children had experienced enough adult evasion in their young lives. "Yes, I was. I couldn't bear the thought of you being separated, and I care about all of you very much. But having your uncle in your lives is better. He's family who knew your parents and can share memories and history that I couldn't." This straightforward acknowledgement seemed to satisfy something important for Emma. "We could have been happy with you too," she said with surprising emotional maturity. "But I think Mom and Dad would want us with Uncle Mason." The conversation shifted to lighter topics as Michael joined them, bringing a drawing he'd created under the guidance of one of the teenage counselors, a surprisingly detailed rendering of the cabin, with 5 small figures and 2 larger ones standing before it. The symbolism wasn't subtle, but carried powerful emotional resonance in its child's depiction of newfound family security. Dinner that evening took on an almost celebratory quality, the combination of improved weather, scheduled rescue, and emotional connections established, creating an atmosphere markedly different from the tense survival focus of previous meals. Mason had somehow produced ingredients for a reasonably festive meal despite circumstances, and the children participated enthusiastically in preparation tasks. As evening settled over the mountain, Mason gathered the 5 siblings for what he termed a family meeting on the cabin's covered porch. Olivia remained inside with Beth and the other children, respecting the privacy of this important conversation while staying available if needed. Through the windows, she could see Mason speaking earnestly to the children, apparently outlining what would happen during rescue and subsequent processing. When they returned inside, the siblings' expressions reflected both apprehension and determination, the realistic assessment of challenges ahead tempered by newfound confidence in adult advocacy. They moved with the cohesive unit formation that had characterized their relationship since orphanhood, but now with Mason clearly incorporated as protective periphery rather than separate authority figure. Later, as most of the cabin's occupants. Settled towards sleep, Olivia found Mason at his communication station, updating emergency services on their status and confirming extraction plans for morning. The quiet competence that had characterized his actions throughout the crisis remained, evident but tempered now with visible emotional investment that he had initially kept carefully controlled. "They're resilient," Olivia observed, joining him at the desk, "more than children should need to be." Mason nodded, his gaze moving to where the Harris siblings had arranged their sleeping bags in their characteristic close formation. Despite having assigned beds available, they've protected each other when the adult world failed them. That bond saved them. He paused, something vulnerable breaking through his composed exterior. "I should have been there sooner." "You were searching for them the entire time," Olivia reminded him. "The system failed all of you." "Systems are made of people," Mason replied, his military precision extending to this assessment. "People who make decisions, maintain records, follow or ignore procedures. Somewhere in that chain, someone prioritized processing efficiency over 5 children's well-being." The judgment wasn't bitter, but factual, a clear-eyed evaluation of institutional failure. Olivia couldn't disagree. Her own experience with educational bureaucracy had shown similar patterns, procedures becoming ends unto themselves rather than tools serving human needs. "So we make sure that doesn't happen again, starting tomorrow." Mason met her gaze directly, something shifting in his expression. "Thank you for being their advocate before I found them, for continuing now. They need consistency, people who've been present through their hardest times." The acknowledgement carried deeper meaning, recognition that the children's healing would require not just legal guardianship, but a supportive community. Mason wasn't seeking to replace existing positive connections, but to incorporate them into the new family structure he hoped to create. As darkness settled completely over the mountain, the cabin's occupants found sleep with greater ease than previous nights. The immediate threat passed, and futures beginning to take more defined shape. Tomorrow would bring rescue and the beginning of complex navigation through systems that had already failed these children once. But tonight, in the aftermath of catastrophe, 27 survivors rested in hard-earned safety, while 5 orphaned siblings slept secure in the knowledge that they had found family they didn't know existed, an uncle who had never stopped searching for them, and a teacher who had been willing to become family when no biological connections seemed possible. The threads of connection, stretched thin by bureaucracy and circumstance, had somehow held through disaster, bringing together people who needed each other in ways none could have anticipated when the first floodwaters began to rise. The morning of rescue dawned clear and bright, as if nature itself had exhausted its fury and now offered perfect visibility for evacuation operations. The distant thrum of helicopter rotors reached the cabin shortly after breakfast, growing steadily louder as the aircraft approached their location. Mason's emergency radio crackled with the pilot's voice. "Granite Point search and rescue to Ridge Cabin. We have your location in sight. Preparing for landing in the clearing east of your position. Over." Mason confirmed receipt and landing zone details, his military precision evident in the crisp communication. The approaching rescue represented the formal end of their isolation, the transition point between the protected space they'd created within the cabin and the complex systems awaiting them below. "Remember our plan," Olivia told the Harris siblings as they gathered their few possessions, mostly donated clothing from Mason's supplies and the precious family photographs Emma had carefully preserved. "Your uncle has documentation, and I'll be with you through the entire process." The children nodded with the solemn seriousness that still seemed incongruous on such young faces. Their time in the system had taught them to approach transitions with cautious preparedness rather than relief or excitement. Only Michael, the youngest at 6, showed visible anticipation at the helicopter's approach, his natural childhood enthusiasm briefly overriding learned wariness. Beth had organized the other children with remarkable efficiency, each with a designated buddy, emergency contact information securely fastened to clothing, and clear understanding of evacuation procedures. The teenage counselors maintained their positions of responsibility, having grown visibly in confidence and capability through the ordeal. "You've done extraordinary work with them," Olivia told Beth, as they watched the children line up for final headcount. "They'll carry these lessons for life." Beth's expression mixed professional satisfaction with deeper emotional resonance. Crisis reveals core character. These kids showed remarkable courage and adaptability. She glanced toward the Harris siblings, now clustered around Mason as he knelt to help Michael with his makeshift backpack. Some stories end better than others. I'm glad theirs might. The helicopter appeared over the ridgeline, a bright orange search and rescue model with county emergency management markings. It circled once, assessing the landing zone, then descended with practiced precision into the clearing Mason had designated, a natural meadow approximately 50 yards from the cabin. 2 rescue personnel approached across the clearing as the rotors slowed to idle. The lead figure, a woman in her 40s wearing a flight suit with paramedic insignia, introduced herself as Captain Rodriguez. "We've got 2 more birds incoming," she explained after confirming their head count and basic status. "Standard evacuation. Protocol is children and injured first, then remaining adults." Mason nodded his understanding. "The Harris siblings should remain together," he stated. Not a request, but a calm assertion of necessary procedure. "I have documentation establishing kinship relation as their uncle and initiating guardianship proceedings." Captain Rodriguez assessed him briefly, the practiced evaluation of someone who regularly encountered civilians in crisis situations. Whatever she observed in Mason's composed demeanor apparently satisfied her professional judgment. "Noted. They'll travel together on the 2nd helicopter with you and Miss Parker once it arrives. We'll take the remaining children and Miss Stevens on this lift." The efficiency of evacuation proceeded with minimal drama, the first group departing after brief goodbyes, the 2nd helicopter arriving within 20 minutes, the final transport preparing to evacuate remaining personnel and equipment. Throughout, Mason maintained calm authority that balanced military precision with genuine care, ensuring the children understood each step of the process before it occurred. As they boarded their designated helicopter, Olivia noticed Emma maintaining physical contact with her younger siblings, a hand on Lily's shoulder, careful visual tracking of the twins' positions, attentive monitoring of Michael's response to the unfamiliar aircraft. The 8-year-old had developed hypervigilance as survival mechanism, relaxing that vigilance would require time and consistent evidence of reliable adult protection. Mason seemed to recognize this dynamic without explanation, positioning himself to maintain clear sightlines between all 5 siblings during the flight, while engaging Michael in conversation about helicopter operations. Gentle distraction that acknowledged the boy's anxiety while providing constructive focus. The aerial view revealed the full extent of destruction across the valley. Roads transformed into riverbed, structures completely vanished, familiar landmarks altered beyond recognition. Yet amid the devastation, signs of human resilience had already emerged. Emergency vehicles navigating improvised routes, work crews clearing critical infrastructure, evacuation centers visibly operational at designated gathering points. There, landing at the County Emergency Management Center brought immediate immersion in the organized chaos of disaster response. Medical triage stations, registration processing tables, family reunification areas, and the constant movement of emergency personnel managing multiple priorities simultaneously. The system threatened immediate separation as various officials attempted to direct different groups toward appropriate processing stations. Here, Olivia witnessed Mason's calm authority transformed into something more assertive, not aggressive, but unmovable. A clear communication that the Harris siblings would remain together under his supervision throughout all procedures. His military, bearing and precise documentation carried sufficient weight to prevent automatic separation, but Olivia's intervention proved equally valuable. Her recognition by local school administration officials and personal connection to the district family court judge created procedural flexibility that might otherwise have been impossible during crisis operations. Judge Wilkins will want to review this case personally, Olivia informed the overwhelmed intake coordinator, her teacher's voice projecting confident authority. These children have experienced significant system failure previously. Direct communication with the judge will prevent further complications. This combination of Mason's documentation and Olivia's institutional knowledge created a protective bubble around the Harris siblings during processing. Medical evaluation conducted with all 5 present, registration completed as a family unit. Rather than individual cases, and most critically, temporary emergency kinship placement approved pending formal hearing rather than automatic return to the group home. Throughout this complex navigation, the children remained remarkably composed, following Mason and Olivia's guidance with the trust they'd developed during their shared ordeal. Even Emma's hypervigilance had noticeably decreased, her monitoring of siblings continuing, but without the desperate intensity that had characterized her behavior in the system. The critical moment came when temporary placement decisions were finalized. The emergency management official reviewed Mason's documentation one final time, then stamped the necessary forms with an approval that carried profound significance beyond its bureaucratic function. Mr. Reed, you're granted emergency kinship. Placement for all 5 children pending formal hearing with family court. Judge Wilkins has scheduled preliminary review for next Tuesday at 9 a.m. The official's voice carried the flat efficiency of someone processing hundreds of similar cases, but the impact of his words transformed 5 young lives instantaneously. Jason was the first to fully comprehend the implication, his 9-year-old, face showing cautious hope. We're staying with Uncle Mason right now, not going back to Blue Spruce. That's right, Olivia confirmed, kneeling despite her still tender ankle to address him at eye level. You'll go home with your uncle today. I'll see you at school once classes resume, and I'll be at the court hearing Tuesday to help explain everything to the judge. The emotional release that followed was both subtle and profound, not dramatic celebration, but visible easing of tension that had become so constant the children had normalized it. Shoulders lowered fractionally, breathing patterns shifted, and most tellingly, the tight formation they'd maintained for 18 months relaxed into more natural spacing while maintaining family cohesion. 3 days later, Olivia drove the familiar mountain road toward Mason's cabin, navigating around repair crews still addressing flood damage throughout the region. The major routes had been cleared for essential traffic, though full reconstruction would require months. Her Jeep, remarkably undamaged despite its exposure during the storm, handled the deteriorated road conditions with reliable competence. The cabin appeared different in normal daylight, less mysterious refuge, more practical homestead designed. With careful attention to both function and comfort, Mason had been working since their return, evidence of preparations for the children visible in newly constructed bunk beds, visible through windows, and a basketball hoop installed beside the cleared area that had served as helicopter landing zone. All 5 Harris siblings emerged at the sound of her vehicle, their familiar formation now centered around the cabin's front steps rather than institutional hallways. The subtle shift in their positioning spoke volumes about adjustment already in progress, still protective of each other, but with the beginning awareness of secure territory rather than defensive vulnerability. Mason appeared in the doorway behind them, his usual composed expression warmed by genuine welcome. "Perfect timing," he called. "We're just finishing lunch setup." The meal had been Olivia's suggestion, a normal social interaction to bridge between the extraordinary circumstances of their meeting and the ongoing relationship that would support the children's transition. She had brought ingredients for their favorite classroom celebration treat, her grandmother's apple cinnamon muffins that had become traditional rewards for academic achievements. Inside, the cabin had already begun. Transformation from bachelor residence to family home, children's artwork appearing on refrigerator doors, reading materials appropriate for various ages arranged on accessible shelves, and most significantly, the family photographs Emma had salvaged, now prominently displayed in proper frames. As they gathered around the large oak table, Olivia noticed new photographs alongside the historical ones, images Mason had taken since their return, capturing the children exploring their new home environment. These visual markers of present experience joining past memories represented exactly the therapeutic approach child development specialists would have recommended, honoring history while creating new narrative. Ms. Wilkins called this morning. Mason told Olivia as they prepared lunch together. The children engaged in setting the table with enthusiastic, if somewhat chaotic, energy. "She's reviewed all documentation and spoken with the case manager. Barring unexpected developments, she anticipates approving permanent guardianship at Tuesday's hearing." The news carried enormous significance despite its bureaucratic framing. 5 children who had faced potential separation would officially remain together with biological family who genuinely wanted them. The system that had failed them was, however belatedly, functioning as intended. "She's a fair judge," Olivia confirmed. "She prioritizes children's well-being over procedural convenience." Lunch progressed with surprising normalcy, conversation flowing between school topics, cabin improvements, and plans for the children's bedrooms. The siblings showed glimmers of typical childhood behavior emerging from beneath the protective adaptations they'd developed, James discussing books with enthusiasm, Lily describing an elaborate art project, the twins debating basketball techniques they planned to practice on the new hoop. Most remarkable was Michael, whose characteristic silence had given way to cautious engagement, occasionally addressing questions directly to Mason without filtering through older siblings, as had been his pattern since losing his parents. The 6-year-old's gradual trust represented perhaps the most significant indicator of security taking root. After the meal, Mason gave Olivia a tour of the property modifications he'd already implemented and those still planned, educational. Spaces for homeschooling options, individual areas designed to honor each child's interests and developmental needs, and safety improvements appropriate for children still learning wilderness skills. "You've thought of everything," Olivia observed as they walked the property's perimeter, the children visible through trees as they explored a small stream under Emma's watchful supervision. "I've had 18 months to plan," Mason replied simply. "Ever since I learned what happened to Daniel and Catherine, everything else was just waiting to find them." The statement held no dramatic emotion, but carried profound truth. This man had reorganized his entire life around children he hadn't seen in years, maintaining faith in eventual reunion despite system obstacles and bureaucratic dead ends. That steady determination had positioned him perfectly to rescue them when catastrophe struck, a convergence of preparation and opportunity that defied simple coincidence. As afternoon progressed toward evening, the children gravitated naturally to include Olivia in their activities. showing her favorite spots they'd discovered on the property, seeking her opinion on room decoration plans, and most tellingly, beginning to share dreams extending beyond immediate survival for the first time since losing their parents. "I might want to be a helicopter pilot," Jason confided as they watched. Birds from the porch. "After seeing how they helped people during the flood, Uncle Mason says I'm good at mapping," James added. "He's teaching me how to use real topographical maps like rescuers use." These tentative expressions of future orientation represented critical healing milestones, children beginning to envision possibilities beyond immediate threats, reconstructing normal developmental horizons that trauma had previously compressed to mere survival. As Olivia prepared to depart, Emma approached with uncharacteristic hesitation, something clutched carefully in her hands. "We made this for you," she said, presenting a framed photograph, one of Mason's recent images showing all 5 siblings with their uncle on the cabin's front steps, genuine smiles beginning to replace their usual cautious expressions. "So you remember how you helped us find family again?" Emma explained, the 8-year-old's perceptiveness once more revealing emotional understanding beyond her years. The simple gift carried complex significance, acknowledgement of both the extraordinary circumstances that had brought them together and the continuing relationship they were building beyond crisis. Olivia accepted it with appropriate seriousness, recognizing the symbolic weight it carried for children, relearning trust in adult commitment. As she drove back toward town in the gathering dusk, Olivia reflected on the extraordinary chain of events that had transformed 7 lives. What had begun as desperate emergency response to natural disaster had revealed connections long obscured by bureaucratic failure. 5 orphan children had discovered family they didn't know existed. A grieving uncle had found the nieces and nephews he'd searched for relentlessly, and she herself had gained important perspective on system limitations and the power of persistent human connection to overcome institutional obstacles. The road ahead would hold challenges, trauma recovery requiring professional support, educational adjustments, legal proceedings to formalize guardianship, and the complex integration of grief, loss, and new beginnings. But watching the cabin recede in her rearview mirror, Olivia felt genuine optimism about this particular story's trajectory. Sometimes, amid catastrophe, things broke in ways that allowed proper mending of previous invisible fractures. The flood had destroyed infrastructure, homes, and established patterns, but in doing so, it had cleared paths for connections that bureaucracy had previously obscured. 5 orphaned children, and the uncle who had never stopped searching for them, finally reunited when disaster swept away the barriers between them. As darkness settled completely over the mountain, stars emerged in brilliant clarity above terrain still bearing catastrophic scars. Similarly, 5 young lives continued navigating grief's landscape, while simultaneously discovering new constellations of possibility. Family unexpectedly reclaimed, security gradually rebuilding, and future horizons expanding beyond mere survival toward genuine thriving. Not despite their extraordinary ordeal, but in some mysterious way because of the connections it had revealed when floodwaters swept away everything except what mattered most. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.